Hello and welcome back to my studio. You may remember in a previous film I did this watercolour chart. It's a swatch chart where basically it's samples of all the colours that I have here in my studio. Now that is the most basic version, but today we're going to progress on and we're going to produce one of these watercolour charts. These are great references for people who maybe don't have a full understanding of the way that two watercolours, the different colours, mix together. It's quite an enjoyable thing to do, and it should help prevent some of those frustrating times when you can't get just the right green or yellow that you want for your painting. So let's make a watercolour chart. Now let's get started with a watercolour chart. And to do one of these, there's a couple of things that you need. Firstly, some nice fresh paper. And what I like to use is the paper that I do most of my paintings on. And that means that the watercolour mixes that I do will be relevant to the painting paper that I use. If you use something inferior or a different type of paper, it may not have the same effect with the watercolour mixing that you would do when you come to painting. So a nice bit of paper. You'll need a ruler, some sort of ruler, a pencil, and if you want to make it a bit more definite, use a fine liner pen. You'll need some clean water. I have a small pot of clean water which I use to dip in and pick up the pigments with, and then a larger pot of clean water which I use to clean my brushes. You'll do an awful lot of brush cleaning in this exercise. And then you'll need the paints that you're going to make the colour chart with. Now for me, I have two sets. I have this, which you may have seen in another film, is my field painting box. And then here in the studio, I use a bigger palette with larger mixing areas, and they have the same colours that I use in my field box. Except in here, there's 3 extra trays for putting paint in. And I fill those up with an extra blue, a cobalt blue, a light red, and a white. But as I'm only going to use the 12 colours that are in my field painting box, those 3 new colours aren't going to be relevant for this exercise. Also, have to hand some kitchen paper, which is very handy for cleaning out your brushes. You'll also need a brush. And for the watercolour chart, what I like to use is a small, this is a 3/8 size brush, a flat, and it's very easy to apply the paint into the squares that we're going to draw for the watercolour chart. It's also very important to have a nice clean palette, because you want to use the freshest, cleanest colours in the watercolour chart as possible. So I've cleaned these off, but for this exercise, even though I'm going to use the 12 colours from the field box, I'm going to work with this palette because it has larger areas to mix the colours in. I also think it's quite important when you're actually painting to keep these colours fairly clean, because they do get contaminated, you can't help it. But if you start off your work with fresh, bright colours, you'll get those colours coming through in your watercolour painting. So let's get on with the actual painting of the watercolour chart. Now, to save a bit of time, I've actually already prepared a piece of paper with the grid that I've drawn up. I'm going to talk about the watercolour chart grid in a moment, but down the side here I've put some squares, 12 squares of the colours that I use, my standard colours that I use in my paintings. And these are the ones which you'll find in my field box. Now the colours that I use, I find are most helpful for the type of scene that I normally paint, and that's moorland and countryside scenes. Now if most of your paintings are done in a different type of environment, like coastal scenes or something like that, you'll probably have picked various colours that aren't in my palette. But this watercolour chart is basically to show you how to produce one of these charts. So let's put on some paint. Down the side here I've made 12 squares. They're quite large, and I'm going to show you the colours that I use in my standard paintings. So let's pick up a bit of clean water, and the first colour that I'm going to go with is this one, and it's lemon yellow. This is straight out of the palette, and I'm going to put that in there. Clean my brush in the big pot, give it a wipe. Next to it is another yellow, and that's cadmium yellow. Keeping with the sort of yellows, which is raw sienna. Next, it's burnt sienna. Next, cadmium red. And that's followed by alizarin crimson. Now we go on to burnt umber. Hooker's green. Viridian. Cerulean blue. French ultramarine. And lastly, Payne's grey. So those are the colours that I have in my palettes. As I say, they're set out here in my field painting box as the 12, and that's the 12 that I've put on show here. I was asked in a previous comment on the film that I did on this watercolour box which colours I use, so I've put them out here just in reply to that question. And next we're going to go on to the actual watercolour chart itself. Those are nice and dry. So next we go on to make the grid for the watercolour chart. And this is where the pencil and ruler come in. And the idea is that you make a grid that's square. So you have the same number along the top as you do have down the side. In my case, it's 12 by 12. That's a total of 144 squares. You can make them as big or as small as you like, but do remember that you're going to paint in each of those squares, and you want to make it as neat as possible. That's why I use this flat brush. Now, I would suggest that if you're just fairly new to watercolour painting, you restrict your palette down to something like 6 or 9 different colours. If you go too big and have more than 12 or do 20 or 30, not only do you have a massive chart to fill in, but it gets very confusing as to how different colours work together. So as you can see here, I've made my grid 12 by 12, quite small squares, but what I have done is left a small gap in between every square. And that's because when I come to fill in with the brush, I've left a small space so that the colours don't butt up against each other. You can do this fairly quickly, but you don't want each colour to bleed into the other. That's why there's the small gap. It's also a very good exercise in learning how to fill in definite spaces with your paintbrush. Now what you should do is put the names of the colours on your chart, from left to right along the top and from top to bottom down the side. And I'm just going to put a simple code letter, and I'm going to put them in the order of the colours of the rainbow. That just makes it quite simple. You could do the same. So we begin with the reds and end up with the violets. Right, so that's then coded off, so I know where the colours are going to go. You don't have to be too particular about their order that they're going in. There's no perfect way of doing it. It's up to you. As long as you know what colours you're mixing, that's fine. We started off with cadmium red, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, burnt umber, because they're sort of reds to orange, raw sienna, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, hooker's green, viridian, cerulean blue, French ultramarine and Payne's grey. We don't have any violets as such at the minute. And that's your grid drawn up. Next thing is to get on and do the painting. I've refreshed the water and I have my paints, kitchen paper and paintbrush to hand. This watercolour chart will be divided in half through the diagonal. The top half will be the mixes of colours almost at full strength, and then the bottom half, by adding more water to those same mixes, will get a lighter toner value of all of these colours. You'll see what I mean as we go along. Now, I'm not going to show you me painting the whole of the watercolour chart. That would just take far too long. But I'll get going and hopefully you'll understand as I move along the colours and you can see how the mixing progresses. The first thing I do is to take the first colour, in this case it's cadmium red, and using some clean water I pick up lots of the pigment on my brush and then put blobs of colour in the mixing areas. Now I need 12. I actually really only need 11 along the top row, so I'd put 11 out because I need 11 to mix with other colours and 1 in its neatest form. That'll make the 12. And you're looking for strength of colour here, with the pigment being neat. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, one more, and 11. Now, the first square, it's obviously the neat colour. And I fill in that box there. Try and keep it as neat as possible and within the lines. If you go over a bit, it doesn't matter because you've left that gap between each square. That's that done. Give my brush a clean because I'm actually going to go into the next pan of colour, which is the crimson. And you don't want to contaminate the colours if you can help it. Because you're using neat colour, it takes a bit of cleaning to get the brushes nice and clean. Once you've done that, a bit of clean water into the crimson and pick up the same sort of strength of colour that you had for the red and go to the first area and mix it as best you can 50-50, and then that goes in the next square. So instead of just going along horizontally on the row, what we can do now is add some fresh water and come down to the vertical columns and put the lighter value of that colour in there. And you can see that we've got the full strength cadmium red there, mixed with the alizarin crimson, full strength there, and then with a bit of water added, we've got a lighter value of that same mix. And that's what we're going to do all the way along and all the way down. I'll do a few more. So you get the idea. Clean your brush, bit of clean water, and then next in this case is burnt sienna. Go into there, mix it with the cadmium red. As I say, you're trying to get a 50-50 mix, and there we are. Burnt sienna, a little bit of water, and come down the vertical column, and that goes in there. You can see why I've left that gap in between the two. They don't meet, so they're not going to bleed one into the other, because all of these paints are still wet. Clean the brush. Bit of fresh water. Next colour we're going to use here is burnt umber. Into another fresh area of cadmium red. Into there, nice like that. Horizontal row first. A little bit of fresh water. And then the lighter value on the vertical column. Clean brush. Bit of fresh water. Next colour, this time is raw sienna. Mixed with red. A little bit of clean water. It doesn't make it too much of an effect in the clean water by just lifting a little drop out just to do this downward value. Now clean the brush. Clean water. Next one is lemon yellow. Horizontally. A dab of water. Clean brush. I'm going to work away along the horizontal and vertical on this first line using the cadmium red as the base, and I'll get back to you in a minute. Okay, and that's the first row complete. You can see there full strength up there, and then down here slightly lighter tonal values on this column. As I say, it's a fairly time-consuming job, especially if you're trying to keep neatly within the squares, but it's a case now of just working away down throughout the whole chart. But what you have to do is at the end of every original colour, in this case the cadmium red, once you've done that, make sure you clean your palette off, ready to start again with the next colour. And now you move on to the next colour, which in this case is the alizarin crimson. And as you can see, we've already done one column. For now, when we go in here, we only need to put 10 blobs of paint plus the neat colour, because as you go down here, it gets less and less. This is the sort of job to do if you've got an hour spare or more than a couple of hours, but it's a well worthwhile exercise. Ten there, and I'll just use a bit of more water, and then I go down to this where the crimsons meet from the horizontal and the vertical, and fill in that square. There we are. Same as before. Wash your brush out. I'll get a bit of clean kitchen paper in a minute, but this will do for now. Bit of clean water, and pick up the first colour, which is the burnt sienna, into there, horizontal first, and then some water just to weaken that down, into here, crimson, burnt sienna, in there, the lighter value. So hopefully you've grasped the idea now. I'll work my way along and I will work through all of the colour chart and come back to you shortly. And that's the last square completed. That took me about an hour to an hour and a half to fill in the whole of the watercolour chart. I did hurry a little bit. You could see maybe where it's bled in, just a couple of occasions where I wasn't too careful. But you could spend a whole day doing one of these and making it much neater than what I have done, but I'm still very pleased with the effect and it's achieved what I set out to do. What I'm going to do now is let this dry, then I'm going to tidy it up and mark out the boxes, and when I've done that I'll come back and explain to you what it's all about and how to use it. And that's my watercolour chart completed. As you can see, I've tidied it all up. I've put black lines around all of the squares and written in the names of the colours and written in the names of the colours on the sample section here. By mixing the colours on my watercolour palette, the 12 different colours, I've come up with this wonderful range of 144 different colours and tones. As you can see, if I place this across the corner to corner axis, all of the colours that run along that line are the pure pigments. Above are the mixed colours in their full strength, using a mix of about 50-50, and then down here using that same mix but with more water to give a lighter tonal value of all of those colours. And look at the variety, all these wonderful reds, oranges, browns. Down here you've got some great greens heading towards the blues, and down here some great neutrals which could be used in various subjects. As I said, this is the colour palette that I use because of where I paint. If you did one of these with your palette, it would come out with a totally different range of colours. But this is the basic colour chart, just by mixing two colours to get a single variation. It doesn't cover what would happen if you mix these to a varying percentage. As I said, these are 50-50. If you did a percentage of 75-25, then it would come out totally different again. But that's a different colour chart. There's other colour charts as well about layering and complementary colours and things like that. Now, if you want to see me do something like that on my channel, then leave a comment below in the box. And as normal, if you've enjoyed the film, do click the like button, and even better, subscribe to the channel, because in the near future I'll be putting more films up, not only about my fell walking, but about my paintings and going outside and doing some work. But as ever, thanks for watching.